Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Cammy is off tonight. After less than 2 hours of deliberations, the Brown County jury delivered a guilty verdict against a former Green Bay correctional officer, Shane Nolan. He's convicted of throwing a woman into a fire pit in a bonfire in a party in 2021. The jury unanimously found him guilty of substantial battery and disorderly conduct. However, his sentence has changed. In a first alert update, now Brittany Schmidt joins us now in the newsroom to explain what that's all about. Brittany.
Bill, this was originally charged as a hate crime, but according to the verdict, that is no longer the case. Both of the charges Nolan faced had enhancements of a hate crime attached to them due to the comments he allegedly made during the incident. The victim accused Nolan of using a homophobic slur before throwing her in the fire. Nolan was looking at the possibility of more than a decade behind bars, but today we are told by the judge those enhancements have been dismissed. Now Nolan is looking at a lesser sentence for this conviction, less than 4 years behind bars, max. The prosecution asked for Nolan's bond to be revoked. The judge disagreed.
I think given his prior track record of success in making it to court and avoiding any problems and following all of those conditions, at this point I will order that bond and associated conditions continue. But to be really clear, Mr. Desai, if there's any change in any part of that process, if the state becomes aware of any concern that there's anyone either on behalf of the defendant himself or anybody who's conducting themselves in such a way that the court ought to review that, you certainly may bring that to my attention.
So Nolan's current bond continues. Sentencing in the case is set for June. Bill?